Hashem, Rabbi. How are you?
Hi, Veronica.
Hi, everybody.
Конец света.
Конец света? Oh,
Yeah.
good. Before Mashiach.
Yeah. Okay. We're all
What's
good.
going
Okay.
now? What now? It definitely feels like very close. Mashiach is gonna come.
Yes, it does. It
I
definitely
hope
does.
so.
Yeah.
Can't get much worse after.
Yeah.
Yes, it can.
If the world has to be crazy before Mashiach comes, I think we're ready.
Right. Right.
Okay.
Can't be any crazier. Yeah, that's for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, everyone, I'm going to get started here. Just to, let's see. Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay. Good evening, everyone. So actually, before we begin, I want to mention that unfortunately, Wednesday evening, we're not going to have a Zoom this Wednesday evening. So please just take a note of that. My apologies in advance. I'm just going to be spending some time with my family. So thank you for that. So one of the things that I'm learning more and more as I experience more of life, which comes with age, and the blessing of living another day, is that there's so much that I thought I knew. In other words, let me say it this way. What I learn more as I go through life is I learn more about how much I don't know than about what I do know. So in other words, I encounter things constantly where I thought I knew, or I just had a perspective, and then, wow, actually it's quite different. And in part, actually, that's a big blessing. It's a big blessing because sometimes we get so locked into our version of reality because it's so safe that we can feel terribly threatened by anything that threatens changing that. That's the reason why truth really doesn't matter in many conversations, because the person is so desperately protecting a reality that it really doesn't make a difference what you tell them and how much you prove it. It's too terrifying for them to be able to hear that. So number one is we simply need to develop the ability to stop protecting the world as we know it. And hopefully we've learned enough to know that the world is so different from the way we often think we know, or the way we often know it, that we hopefully become more and more encouraged to be able to hear that maybe actually it's different, because gosh, so many things are actually so different than the way I thought them to be. So this is all an introduction to this idea that values must come from higher than yourself. Values must come from higher than yourself. The values cannot come, I cannot be the creator of my values. Otherwise, I'm really in deep, deep trouble. I'm living in a very shallow place. Our values must be coming from something that's beyond us. And one of the great tragedies that we can see evolving in a society that systemically, if you want to know what's systemic in our society, this is systemic in our society, that systemically pushes God out and makes belief in God something which is outdated and childish, is that what it does is it actually lowers us to the shallow understanding of humanity. And that is even with the most brilliant of minds, because as we've discussed last week, human beings are inherently biased and agenda driven, and which is virtually impossible for us to free ourselves from. And secondly, even the most brilliant of us doesn't begin to understand the vastness of the universe or the depth of a human body, or, I mean, whatever there is to know. So we can never really fully understand the full picture of things. And so when we get values from the source of all of that, we're in a much, much more solid place, even though we can't understand it, because we can't possibly understand it. It's coming from a place which is way beyond us. That's the second half of the introduction. So we have a fascinating teaching in the Torah this week. It's actually a law, a Jewish law, very interesting legal law. The Torah says, "Al pi shnayim o shlosha eidim yumas hames," that if you want to charge someone for criminal activity, for which the Torah punishes if there is testimony, if there are witnesses that the person violated this criminal act, of death penalty. In order for this death penalty to be implemented for this criminal activity, you need to have two witnesses. Two witnesses. So two witnesses need to come forth and say, we warned the guy that what he's about to do is going to give him the death penalty. And then he did it immediately after we told him. Those are the basic criteria. And then the witnesses are cross-examined, and if their testimony proves to be true, the person gets the death penalty. Now, what happens if you have a case of murder? God forbid. We don't know who did the murder. Or there's a guy who walks out of the room where the man was murdered holding a bloody knife, but there are no witnesses. According to the Torah, you need to have two witnesses to prove the evidence. If there are no witnesses, you cannot try the person. The rabbis have authority if society has gotten out of hand. They have authority for the need of society to punish the person. But biblically, you cannot punish that person. So, however, let's say this guy says, he walks out and he says, I murdered him. And it's eluding me right now, circumstantial evidence, right? You can't get more circumstantial than a bloody knife from a guy who's breathing his last breath and there's no one else around except this guy just walked out of the room. And he says, I killed him. I'm here. I'm in court. Give me the death penalty. You know what the Torah says? No self-incrimination. We don't accept self-incrimination. You cannot incriminate yourself. We throw the guy out of the court. I used a very extreme case, but even if you have a less extreme case of, there's a case of murder. We have no idea who did it. We just find a guy who's dead. And a guy walks into court the next day and he says, it was me. This guy, whatever, he has a story and he says, it was me and I feel terrible, but I did it and here I am. Do whatever you need to do with me. Court throws him out. No self-incrimination. However, in contrast to this, when it comes to a non-criminal case, a financial case, where one guy owes, someone stole $10,000 from a gentleman. We don't have no idea who did it. And the guy walks into court one day, he says, it was me. I stole the $10,000. It's me, I owe him the $10,000. Court says, Jewish law says, Haidas Baldin, the confession of self-incrimination, guy confessing about himself, Kimeya Edim Dami. It's like it's the equivalent of 100 witnesses. In other words, you can't get better testimony than that. But that's only in a non-criminal case. I hope, John, I'm using the right terminology, which I'm sure I'm not, but you understand what I'm saying. But if it's a non-capital case, we accept the guy. If it's a capital case, we throw him out. What's the difference? What is the difference? So the great chief rabbi of Egypt, the Radvaz, from hundreds of years ago, Sephardic rabbi, he explained that here's the difference. The difference is that, am I allowed to, would you think it makes sense for me to be able to come into court and testify, for me to come into court and to make a statement? I'm only one person. So I'm not a peer of witnesses as the Torah mandates. And I come and I tell the court that you are obligated to do something with your money. The court would throw me out. Like, who am I to say what you owe or don't owe? In fact, the court throws out a single witness because you need to have two witnesses. However, if I come into court and I tell the court that I'm obligated a certain amount of money because I did something, as I just explained, the court says I have the right that they listen to me. I'm like 100 witnesses and I incriminate myself. Why? Because my money is mine. Your money is not mine. So I don't get to tell you what you're obligated to do with your money. For example, I'll give you an example, a rabbinic example, or sometimes people, when they fundraise, they sort of think that they have the right to tell another person what they are obligated to do with their money. So they come and they tell the person, you have to give me, right? Or you have to give my organization, right? Which is a very, very arrogant and totally inappropriate thing to say, right? You don't know half of what's going on in this person's life and what they do with their money, right? And who they just gave to an hour ago, right? Or whatever they're doing quietly, whatever it is, we don't know what's going on with another person, and no one owes us anything. No one owes anyone anything, right? So you have no right to tell someone else what to do with their money, but you do have a right to incriminate yourself, to obligate yourself with your own money. However, life is very different, because where does life come from? Money is a worldly item. Our belongings are worldly items. Our life actually is a divine entity. It's actually not something that is of this world. It's a gift entirely from God and is somewhat supernatural. And therefore, when it comes to life, we have no right to give it away. That's why someone is not allowed to actually inflict a wound on themselves. And so therefore, one is not allowed to incriminate themselves with something that would give them the death penalty, because it's not my life. It's God's life. I can't take God's stuff and incriminate the same way I can't take your money and incriminate. I can take my money and incriminate. But life is not ours. This is a very, very profound value, and the implications of this are very profound. By way of example, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal a few years back about that in Iceland, they have been able to virtually eliminate Down syndrome children from being born. Amazing. Wow, how'd they do that? The way they did it was quite simple. They found a way to be able to do very early testing on a fetus, determine whether it was Down syndrome, and convince the mothers to abort the babies. And therefore, they've had hardly any Down syndrome babies being born. Right? So that's how they did it. Right? They didn't figure out how to make sure that babies that are being conceived are not Down syndrome, of course, but they did find how to eliminate. Now that is actually very disturbing. Why is it very disturbing? It's very disturbing because it is a statement by an entire society, or by at least the powers to be in a society, that the life of a Down syndrome child doesn't have value, or has very little value, or I say doesn't have value, and therefore we should eliminate such life. That's essentially what they were saying. Not being able to acknowledge that life doesn't need to be on our terms for it to have value, because life inherently is divine and therefore it has value. And one of the beautiful things that many people have been who have firsthand experience with Down syndrome children is, and anything that actually challenges our own reality, and I'm just using this as one example, and I'll say I have a sister-in-law, Rosie's sister is Down syndrome, and it's a real it's a real blessing to be exposed to a Down syndrome individual. Because at first it's very uncomfortable. You're not sure exactly how to relate or react. We have all of our, quote unquote judgments, which are classic and understandable. But as we develop a relationship with the person, we begin to discover they help us see shades of reality that we otherwise will not see. They help us see beauty in places that we would never see it otherwise. They help us experience love outside of the context that we believe love has to exist in. It's fascinating. It's fascinating. And that only happens through Down syndrome children. I mean, not only through Down syndrome, but only through Down syndrome children and other experiences that take us out of what we, in our mentality, believe to be things to be a certain way. And they expand us significantly as people. They enrich us, and they make us more beautiful by bringing out within us a value and an appreciation for things that otherwise we would not value and appreciate. In order for that to happen, we need to submit ourselves to a higher value, which is that life is inherently sacred. It really is not about what life produces. Life itself is inherently sacred. There was a man by the name of David Mayer who lived, I believe, in California. And 1984, his wife was pregnant with their first baby. I know people nowadays say we are pregnant, but I find that offensive. I don't mean that really offensive. You can always tell me we are pregnant. That's fine. Everyone always tells it to me. But hey, I don't know about, just from watching my wife in pregnancy, I'm not pregnant. That's all I can say. And she's carrying it, not me. And thank God. I mean, thank God to my wife for doing that. It's unbelievable. But anyway, that was just a side comment. So his wife was pregnant with their first child. She gave birth, and their son, they discovered, was Down syndrome. I would say naturally, as he says, they went through a grieving process. It's a big shock. I can only imagine that it's a big shock. And of course, because from our perspective, and that's totally understandable. And they went through a grieving process. And then when their son, who they named Avram, but was 2.5 months old, they decided they want to go to New York and they want to get a blessing from the Rebbe. They needed some encouragement. And they were hoping they'd be able to get a private audience. And this was in February of 1985. The Rebbe was no longer seeing people privately in 1985. So you weren't able to get a private audience anymore at that time. However, they were advised when they came to stand outside of the Rebbe's office. And when the Rebbe would come out of his office to go to daven mincha, he would see them. And generally the Rebbe would interact if he noticed something. And the Rebbe noticed before he even saw things. He was aware of things. So he walked out of his office, and sure enough, he saw them. And the Rebbe classically, when he would see children, the Rebbe always carried coins in his pocket, and he would always take out a coin and give it to the child. And the reason why I would give the coin to the child was not for them to buy ice cream. It was for the child to give that coin to tzedakah. And most likely the child was trained by their parents never to give that coin to tzedakah. But if the Rebbe gave you a nickel, you take another nickel and give it to tzedakah and save the one the Rebbe gave you. But the idea was to promote tzedakah to children, to always give. So he would always give children. So when he came by the parents, the mother was holding their baby Avram. He was 2.5 months old, right? And so the Rebbe took a coin out of his pocket and he stuck it into the baby's hand. But because the baby was Down syndrome, he was very slow in developing, and his muscles of his hand were not yet developed, so he couldn't close his hand on the coin. So the coin fell to the floor. Before the parents sort of caught themselves with what happened, the Rebbe bent down, he picked up the coin, and he put the coin back into the baby's hand and folded the baby's fingers over the coin. In other words, the Rebbe knew exactly what the situation was. So the Rebbe folded his fingers over the coin, and then the Rebbe said to the mother, "These children are my generals. You shouldn't worry, he will be a blessing." And the father commented 30 years later. The father said, that would be in 2014. He commented and said that if a doctor would come to me with a pill that would take away my child's Down syndrome, of course I would give it to him, because for him, that would be the best thing for him. But for me, if that would happen, I would miss the child that I know, which is unbelievable. It's very similar to, I'll tell you another extreme thing that many people say, which is very hard to imagine. And I don't have a right to say, but I can repeat from other people who have said it. Many people say this. Many people have gone through a very life-threatening illness, such as cancer, and they survived. Very often, it's very common for people to say, I would never trade in the experience I went through. I would never ask God to give it to me, but now that I've gone through it, I would never trade it in. Because they see life in a completely different way. Because it makes us rethink everything. In order for us to be able to appreciate a Down syndrome child, when we can learn to appreciate, for example, a Down syndrome child, it's because we've learned that life is much deeper and richer than the model that an average person has by living a common life. And that value is the value when we are open to higher values and not to the way we see it. So when there is no God, we are lowering ourselves to the shallowness of humanity. And when there is God, we are elevating ourselves to a deeper and truer value that gives us a much more profound appreciation for life. And I'm sharing this to say this. I know all of you who are on, obviously, cherish and appreciate God on whatever level that may be. Very often we don't have the words to explain to another person why it is important for us to have God in our lives. And this is a very concrete, realistic, relevant way to explain to someone the difference between living a life without God and living a life with God. And the difference is enormous. So with this, I conclude, and we'll do an unmute. Just a moment there. Here we go. Unmute. All right. If anyone has any comments, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Rabbi. It was very, very insightful and very moving this evening. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Anita. I appreciate that.
Rabbi, thank you very much. It was very moving. I have just few questions.